The night had a quiet tension that felt almost alive. The city skyline glimmered with 1,000 lights, reflecting off the slick streets from the afternoon rain. Inside one of the tallest towers, a celebration was in a penthouse overlooking the glowing urban sprawl. The room smelled faintly of expensive perfume and the sharp tang of red wine. Music played softly in the background, the kind of carefully curated tracks that said, without words, "We belong at the top." Guests laughed in clusters, their voices polished, their movements precise, a choreography of wealth and confidence. Nobody seemed out of place, and yet beneath the laughter there was an undercurrent of something fragile, like a glass ready to crack. In the center of it all was the young man who lived here, a boy in his early 20s, dressed in designer clothes that cost more than most people made in a year. He moved through the room with an easy smile, his parents close behind, nodding at acquaintances and making quiet jokes. His life had been carefully scripted. Private schools, elite clubs, family connections that opened doors in every industry imaginable. The world had always bent around him, shaped by money and influence, and he had learned to expect it to continue doing so. Yet there was a restlessness in his eyes, a flicker of impatience, a desire for attention that even wealth could not fully satisfy. Across the room she stood out, not because she tried to, but because she belonged by merit. She was sharp, confident, the CEO of a tech company that had grown from nothing to a billion-dollar valuation in just a few years. Her presence was commanding but unpretentious. People noticed her not for her clothes or the luxury she could buy, but for the way she spoke, the authority in her voice, the precision in her gestures. She carried herself with a calm certainty that few could challenge. For all her success, though, she had learned to read the undercurrents in rooms like this. She understood who was performing and who was real. That night, she was here to discuss a deal that could change the course of her company, forever $650 million, resting on the promises and egos of people who saw life through the lens of wealth alone. Around them, the party continued in carefully measured waves. Glasses clinked, laughter rose and fell, and subtle competitions played out in the background. Who could talk the loudest, who could impress the most? But the young man watched her differently than the rest. There was a mix of amusement and something darker, a desire to provoke, to test boundaries. It was the kind of energy that comes from never having learned real limits, from being taught that consequences are negotiable if your parents can cover the fallout. His parents laughed easily at his jokes, encouraged his antics, oblivious to the growing tension simmering beneath his bravado. The room was beautiful, polished, and safe in a way that made the coming chaos all the more shocking. The chandelier above caught the light like diamonds, the marble floor gleamed, and the windows offered a panoramic view of the city that seemed untouchable. Yet there was a vulnerability in that perfection, a sense that no matter how well everything was arranged, human behavior was unpredictable. Beneath the polite conversations and the carefully chosen smiles, emotions churned: pride, envy, irritation, and the subtle, creeping desire to dominate. These were the invisible threads that would soon snap, unraveling the lives of everyone present. The CEO, unaware of the brewing storm, navigated the room with practiced ease, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries, and measuring the intentions of those around her. She had learned to detect false charm quickly, to sense when someone's respect was only skin-deep. That night she moved with quiet confidence, ready to seal a deal that would mark her company as untouchable. But the young man, emboldened by privilege and the laughter of his parents, saw her authority not as something to respect, but as a challenge, an opportunity for a reckless assertion of power. His actions, small and seemingly inconsequential at first, were guided by impulses that had never been tempered by accountability. Even as conversations continued and wine flowed, there were subtle signs of imbalance. The young man's parents shared jokes that cut slightly too deep, laughing at comments that carried undercurrents of condescension. The boy himself leaned a little too close when speaking to the CEO, his smile carrying a hint of mockery that only a few might notice. These were minor cracks in the veneer of civility, the early whispers of chaos that would soon erupt. The room was filled with the illusion of control, but behind that illusion, human emotions, greed, pride, impatience, and entitlement were quietly converging toward a collision. By the time the evening reached its peak, the air felt heavier, charged with the tension of unspoken power struggles. Everyone believed they were in control of the night, of the conversations, of the deals. Nobody realized how quickly a single reckless action could shift everything. In this world of polished surfaces, wealth, and influence, morality was often negotiable, consequences optional. But that night, in the glow of chandeliers and the echo of laughter, the stage was set for a moment that would test the limits of privilege and authority, and reveal just how fragile the balance between arrogance and accountability could be. The fragility was invisible to most, but for the few who could read it, the warning signs were clear. Tension simmered beneath smiles, challenges lurked behind jokes, and the smallest spark could ignite a fire no one could control. The city below continued its endless hum, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the tower, but inside, every gesture, every glance carried weight. The night had begun like any other, with wealth, laughter, and the promise of opportunity, but it would end differently, leaving consequences that no money could erase. The week after the party, the atmosphere around the young man and his family began to shift. What had seemed like harmless fun at first started to echo in unexpected ways. The young man couldn't stop thinking about the CEO, the way she carried herself, how everyone respected her without needing to prove anything. It was infuriating and intoxicating all at once. For him, it became a game of dominance, an invisible battle to see if he could make someone of her stature falter. At the same time, he craved attention, and every glance she gave, every polite smile, became fuel for his obsession. His parents laughed whenever he bragged about the evening, enjoying his antics without recognizing the deeper problem. They had built a life where mistakes could always be corrected with money or influence, never understanding the emotional toll that such behavior could take on the people around them. The CEO returned to her office the day after the party, but the night stayed with her like a shadow she couldn't shake. Her schedule was packed, her mind focused on the $650 million deal and the responsibility it carried for her employees, her investors, and her own ambition. Yet she couldn't ignore the memory of the boy's behavior. There had been a moment when he had leaned in, a smirk on his face, a subtle attempt to assert control in a situation where he had no real power. She brushed it off as arrogance at first, a typical display from someone raised in a world where wealth often replaced maturity. But then messages began arriving, texts that were unnecessary, slightly mocking, and oddly persistent. The CEO recognized them as manipulative, but the growing frequency hinted at something more dangerous, a mind accustomed to pushing boundaries, unaccustomed to being told no. Meanwhile, the young man's parents remained oblivious to the tension. They saw the CEO as just another guest, another businesswoman, another stepping stone to social prestige. Their laughter and pride in their son's antics only encouraged him. Privilege had insulated them from seeing the human cost of his behavior. To them, the world was a series of transactions and impressions. What they didn't realize was that their encouragement was feeding a dangerous pattern. Their son had learned that wealth was a shield, that consequences were optional, and that he could test anyone's limits without risk. Within days, the young man's attempts at attention escalated. He sent more messages, each one crafted to get a reaction to provoke her subtly to see if he could disrupt her composure. Some were jokes, some were veiled compliments, but all carried an edge of mockery. For him, it was thrilling, a test of control. For the CEO, it was increasingly uncomfortable, a ripple of unease she couldn't ignore. She started noticing the patterns in his behavior, the way his parents laughed at things that should have been inappropriate, the way he seemed to measure every interaction like it was a game to be won. Every polite dismissal felt like it wasn't enough. Outside pressures intensified the tension. The CEO was under immense stress, investors were impatient, her company's growth targets were aggressive, and her own reputation had been built on maintaining control under pressure. Any disruption, even a small one, could have cascading effects. At the same time, the young man was living under a different kind of pressure. His family had everything money could buy, but they had also constructed a rigid expectation. He should always be charming, always be confident, always win. Failure was not a word he knew. Disappointment was foreign. The conflict of these two worlds, the CEO's world of earned authority and his world of inherited entitlement, created a friction that no one could ignore. Subplots began to emerge. The CEO had her own history of encountering entitlement and disrespect in her rise to the top. She had dealt with similar behaviors from colleagues and investors, but never from someone so young, so visibly coddled, and yet so determined to provoke. She kept a private journal where she reflected on these encounters, aware that each incident was a test of her composure, a subtle challenge to her authority. She began to notice the way the young man's actions mirrored a pattern of privilege unchecked by accountability, and it unnerved her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The young man's obsession started to invade his daily life. At school or work, he would recount moments from the party, exaggerating interactions, framing himself as the clever instigator in a story no one else fully understood. His friends began to notice his fixation, teasing him at first, then giving him space as they realized he was consumed. The more he obsessed, the bolder his attempts became, until subtle manipulation turned into reckless behavior. He tried to engineer encounters where he could provoke her subtly to watch her reaction. He would comment on her achievements in public, add mocking inflections, and note how she responded. Every glance, every word became a psychological chess move, and he began enjoying the tension more than the event itself. The young man's parents, meanwhile, remained cheerfully unaware. They had built a world in which appearances mattered more than actions. They continued to entertain investors and socialites, laughing when their son played around at gatherings, never recognizing that their indulgence was fueling a dangerous sense of entitlement. They assumed the CEO would find the antics amusing, that she would recognize the humor in a spoiled boy's teasing. They had no idea that each joke, each taunt, was a test of boundaries that she had learned to guard carefully. Their laughter was the wind feeding the flames of a growing conflict. The CEO began to take subtle steps to protect herself. Meetings were scheduled more formally, boundaries reinforced. She responded politely, firmly, never letting the young man's provocations disrupt her professionalism. Still, tension bubbled beneath the surface. Every interaction carried a weight neither side could fully articulate. On one hand, a young man testing limits; on the other, a powerful woman trying to maintain control in a world that had made her fight for it. Both were aware, consciously or not, that a breaking point was approaching. By the time the young man's obsession became more public, through whispered comments among friends and small pranks, the CEO was preparing to meet his parents again for business negotiations. She anticipated their polished smiles, their condescending humor, and the possibility that their son's behavior might escalate. In private, she reviewed the company's position carefully, aware that any misstep could jeopardize not only the deal but her entire reputation. She knew that the room they would meet in would be a delicate battlefield of wealth, entitlement, and authority, and that the young man's antics could ignite an unpredictable outcome. The stage was set for confrontation. Tension had grown from subtle gestures into visible friction, with each character carrying their own pressures, insecurities, and expectations. The young man's need for dominance and attention had collided with the CEO's insistence on respect and order. His parents' laughter and indulgence had emboldened him, while external pressures, from investors, society, and personal histories, exacerbated the strain. Every small interaction, every whispered comment, every polite dismissal added weight to an invisible scale, tipping ever closer to a breaking point that no one could ignore. When the day of the meeting arrived, the atmosphere was charged. The young man was eager, his parents expectant, and the CEO alert, prepared but wary. Every handshake, every smile, every polite phrase carried tension, unspoken challenges, and simmering frustration. Beneath the surface, darker impulses lingered. The boy's desire to assert power through recklessness, the CEO's determination to protect her integrity, and the parents' unawareness of the storm brewing under their roof. The collision of privilege, obsession, and authority was inevitable, and the events that followed would mark a turning point that none of them would forget. The afternoon of the meeting arrived with an almost palpable tension, thick enough to taste. The sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the CEO's conference room glinted off the polished table, casting reflections that seemed almost alive, flickering with the unspoken friction in the room. The smell of leather chairs and expensive coffee mingled with the faint perfume of the CEO and the faintly cologne-scented presence of the young man. At first, the meeting began politely, with the CEO shaking hands with the parents, exchanging measured pleasantries, and outlining the terms of the $650 million deal. Everything seemed formal, controlled, and professional, but beneath the surface, a storm was gathering. The young man sat across from her, his posture casual but his eyes sharp, scanning for opportunities to provoke. His parents laughed too easily at his jokes, leaning back in their chairs, clearly confident that their son's antics were harmless. They didn't see the way the CEO's jaw tightened, subtle and almost imperceptible, or the flicker of warning in her eyes. She had dealt with arrogance before, but not this. An impulsive, entitled display fueled not by malice alone, but by a sense of inherited power that made him reckless. It started small. A comment here, a joke there, his smirk growing with each glance he dared to steal. The CEO responded politely at first, her tone firm but calm. "We can focus on the terms of the agreement," she said, trying to steer the discussion back to business. But the boy leaned forward, mocking subtly, letting his glass of red wine slide over the edge of the table as he gestured toward her. The wine caught the light, a deep crimson against the pale marble, and then, without a word, he tipped it, and it spilled across the pristine surface, arcing through the air toward her. Time slowed in that moment. The glass hit her shoulder, spilling the wine across her blouse and dripping to the floor, dark and warm against her skin. Shock registered first, in her eyes, disbelief. Then came anger, a controlled, icy fury that made her presence feel suddenly electrified. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the thrill in his face, the complete disregard for respect, boundaries, and professionalism. He grinned, confident that this minor act of humiliation was clever, that his parents' laughter would validate it. Instead, he met the full weight of her authority, quiet yet impossible to ignore. Her reaction was immediate. She stood, each movement precise, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Enough!" It was a word heavy with consequence, controlled but full of power. The young man froze, the smirk faltering slightly. His parents chuckled nervously, still assuming it was a joke, but the CEO's eyes swept over them in a single, unyielding glance that drained the room of laughter. "This behavior ends now," she said, her voice rising just enough to command attention without shouting. The contrast between her calm control and his reckless glee created a tension that felt almost physical, pressing down on everyone in the room. The parents tried to laugh it off, attempting to diffuse the situation with empty reassurances, but the CEO had already made her decision. She pulled her phone from her bag, fingers trembling slightly, not with fear, but with the adrenaline of asserting control in a world that tried to underestimate her. A single call, a few words, and the $650 million deal. Their prestige, their influence, everything they had relied on was instantly suspended. Panic erupted in the parents' eyes, confusion and disbelief flooding their expressions as they realized the consequences were real. Their son's action, once laughed off, had shattered an opportunity they had counted on as untouchable. The young man's reaction shifted rapidly from amusement to shock. For the first time, he faced a boundary he could not cross with charm or money. His parents' laughter faded, replaced by frantic attempts to negotiate, to explain, to somehow reverse what had happened. The room felt like it was closing in, the air thick with tension, the smells of spilled wine and expensive perfume merging with the metallic tang of adrenaline. He realized with sudden clarity that this wasn't a game he could win. The CEO's composure, which had seemed so easy to maintain, was now a weapon, cutting through privilege and entitlement like a knife. Voices rose in confusion. The CEO remained steady, but her eyes burned with the seriousness of someone who had fought for every inch of respect she had earned. The young man's parents attempted to regain control, speaking over her, but each word seemed futile. The CEO's firm insistence and the authority in her demeanor forced them to pause, realizing that money and status could not undo a moment of recklessness. The young man's mind raced, guilt mixing with fear, a cocktail of emotions he had never had to face before. He had been protected his entire life from the consequences of impulsive actions, and now, for the first time, he was confronting the reality that not everything could be bought or laughed away. In the immediate aftermath, chaos rippled through the room. The parents tried to smooth things over, offering apologies that felt hollow, grasping at explanations that would make the incident seem trivial. The CEO, calm but unyielding, rejected any attempt to downplay the situation. Her decision was clear, her mind already calculating the impact, considering the employees and stakeholders who depended on her judgment. Every second stretched, charged with tension, as the young man's exhilaration dissolved into dread. His earlier arrogance collided with the reality of accountability, leaving him shaken. There was an almost surreal quality to the moment. The polished conference room, the spilled wine, the sudden collapse of the parents' confidence, and the CEO standing firm, a figure of authority impossible to ignore. It was a tableau of privilege confronting consequence, a collision of recklessness and responsibility played out in high-definition emotional clarity. The room felt small, every breath heavy with the weight of what had just happened. As the CEO gathered her things and left, the young man's parents were left staring at the space where her authority had stood. Their laughter was gone, replaced by whispered fears, heated whispers, and frantic attempts to regain control of a situation that had slipped irreversibly from their grasp. The young man sat frozen, processing the first real moment in his life when wealth could not shield him. Guilt, fear, and disbelief collided in his mind, leaving him trapped in the emotional fallout of a single reckless act. The crime itself, the tipping of the wine, seemingly small, almost playful, had become a catalyst for a dramatic upheaval. In that instant, privilege, entitlement, and recklessness had met discipline, authority, and accountability. The emotional intensity was raw and unfiltered. The CEO's quiet power, the young man's panic, the parent's desperation, all converged to create a moment of chaos that no one could ignore. Spilled wine marked not just the incident, but the collapse of illusions, the breaking of, and the irreversible consequences of ignoring human limits. The day after the incident, the penthouse felt emptier than it ever had, though it was the same polished space with the same panoramic view of the city. The laughter that had once echoed against the marble walls was gone, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that made every corner of the room feel heavy. The young man sat on a velvet chair, staring at the floor, replaying the moment over and over in his head. In his mind, the tipping of the wine had been a joke, a harmless assertion of control, but now it loomed like a weight he couldn't lift. Guilt gnawed at him, though he struggled to admit it even to himself. For someone who had spent years believing that money and status could erase mistakes, this confrontation with consequence was bewildering, even terrifying. His parents, meanwhile, floundered in denial. They continued to tell themselves that the incident had been a misunderstanding, that the CEO was overreacting, that their son hadn't meant harm. They spoke in hushed tones, trying to justify the behavior, framing it as youthful energy rather than recklessness. But underneath the rationalizations, fear had begun to take root. The deal that had promised to cement their social and financial dominance was gone. They could see the consequences stretching out before them, a $650 million void that no charm or connections could fill. Their confidence, once absolute, was fractured, leaving them grasping at explanations that felt increasingly hollow. The CEO, in contrast, felt a mix of anger, vindication, and exhaustion. She had stood her ground, protecting her company and asserting authority, but the emotional toll was real. In the privacy of her office, she replayed the encounter again and again, analyzing every gesture, every word, every subtle shift in the young man's expression. She had anticipated arrogance and entitlement, but the sheer recklessness of his actions had been a shock. Yet even in her frustration, there was clarity. She had acted decisively, ensuring her company's interests were protected. Still, a part of her carried the weight of confrontation, the knowledge that even a moment of asserting justice could leave lingering tension and resentment. Friends and colleagues of the young man began to notice changes, too. Some whispered about the incident, speculating on the gravity of the situation, while others avoided mention altogether. The young man, who had once thrived on attention, now found it uncomfortable. The teasing that had once delighted him turned sour as whispers of the CEO's decisive response began circulating. He realized that not everyone shared his family's indulgent perspective, and the sudden attention, laced with judgment, unsettled him. Guilt mingled with embarrassment, creating a psychological storm that he had never experienced before. The parents attempted damage control in public, reaching out to contacts, sending messages, and arranging calls, all in the hope of salvaging what they could. But the CEO's decision was final. The $650 million deal, the prestige, the social validation, they had all vanished in an instant. Attempts to rationalize or mitigate the situation felt like grasping at smoke. Every conversation, every effort only reinforced the reality. Privilege could not always protect, and influence could not always sway outcomes. Within the family, tension grew. The young man's parents were frustrated not just by the loss of the deal, but by the realization that their son's behavior had forced them to confront limits they had long ignored. Arguments erupted behind closed doors, angry exchanges about irresponsibility, entitlement, and the consequences of being shielded from reality. The young man, in turn, vacillated between defiance and despair. He had always believed the world would bend for him, but now he had seen firsthand that arrogance could provoke real consequences. The emotional weight of that realization changed him in subtle but profound ways. Confidence wavered, entitlement felt suddenly exposed, and guilt settled like a shadow he could not shake. The ripple effects extended beyond the immediate family. The CEO's employees and investors felt the tension of the confrontation, though they mostly learned of it indirectly. News of the incident spread through industry channels, framing the CEO as unyielding and principled, while portraying the young man and his family as reckless and entitled. The story circulated in business circles and on social media, highlighting the collision between privilege and accountability. Public perception shifted. The parents, once admired for their wealth and influence, were now scrutinized for the indulgence that had encouraged reckless behavior. The young man became a symbol of arrogance untempered by consequence, a cautionary tale whispered in elite gatherings. Emotionally, the young man retreated into himself. He avoided friends and gatherings, replaying the event, haunted by the CEO's unflinching authority and the stark reality of what his actions had cost. Anxiety and shame became constant companions, emotions he had rarely, if ever, confronted. The parents, too, felt the strain, though they masked it with attempts to maintain appearances. Behind closed doors, fear and frustration gnawed at them, revealing the fragile foundations upon which their lives had been built. For the CEO, there was a lingering tension as well. Though she had acted decisively, she remained aware that her stance had disrupted the carefully curated world of the young man and his family. She felt vindicated in her actions, but also a solemn awareness that power comes with responsibility and that enforcing boundaries, though necessary, carries emotional weight. The confrontation had been cathartic, yes, but it also reminded her that human behavior, when fueled by privilege and unchecked impulse, can be unpredictable and destabilizing. Weeks passed, and the incident continued to cast a shadow. The young man's confidence, once near invincible, had fractured. His parents, though trying to maintain composure, could not hide their frustration and anxiety. Their reputation, previously untouchable in social and business circles, had taken a visible hit. The CEO, meanwhile, her authority, her decisiveness earning respect across the industry, but leaving behind a personal awareness of how delicate control can be when challenged by reckless entitlement. The aftermath was a study in contrasts. Privilege had collided with accountability, arrogance with authority, and the results were immediate and enduring. The young man faced an internal reckoning, the parents confronted the limits of indulgence, and the CEO navigated the responsibilities of power with clarity and resolve. Each individual carried the emotional and psychological weight of that single reckless act, a weight that would influence decisions, relationships, and perceptions for years to come. In the months that followed, the incident at the penthouse left a mark far deeper than spilled wine. The young man, once untouchable in his world of inherited privilege, faced the consequences of his impulsive behavior in ways he had never imagined. His parents tried to shield him, reaching out to lawyers, publicists, and social connections, but the damage was irreversible. The CEO had acted decisively, canceling the $650 million deal and reinforcing the reality that actions, however seemingly minor or playful, carry weight. For the young man, the lesson was harsh and personal. Wealth could not erase recklessness, and charm could not undo humiliation when wielded recklessly against someone with authority and integrity. The confidence that had defined him began to falter, replaced by anxiety and the quiet shame of public scrutiny. His parents, too, were forced to confront a truth they had long avoided. Their laughter at his antics, their indulgence of entitlement, and their assumption that money could solve every problem had enabled reckless behavior. The collapse of the deal, once seen as inconceivable, was now a stark reminder that their influence had limits. Privilege, they realized, could not shield them from accountability, nor could it repair reputations once they were fractured. Social circles whispered, acquaintances alliances, and the family's image of untouchable status eroded. The parents, accustomed to controlling outcomes, now had to face the consequences of failing to instill boundaries or respect in their son. For the CEO, the fallout was different but no less significant. Her decision to cancel the deal was a demonstration of authority, ethics, and the courage to stand firm, but it carried its own emotional and professional weight. She had protected her company, her employees, and her own principles, yet the confrontation left her wary of the subtle ways privilege and entitlement can manifest. She had seen how power can be misused, how recklessness fueled by social and financial advantage can threaten stability, and how asserting control often comes at the cost of personal energy and emotional strain. Yet in standing her ground, she earned widespread respect, her reputation as a decisive and principled leader. Her actions became a cautionary example of accountability triumphing over entitlement. The broader societal reaction was swift and unforgiving. News of the incident spread through business circles and social media, highlighting the young man's impulsiveness and the parents' indulgence. Discussions arose about the intersection of wealth, morality, and respect, and the story became a symbol of how privilege can distort perceptions of right and wrong. public opinion largely sided with the CEO, applauding her for defending her position and holding the family accountable, while the young man became a cautionary tale for the dangers of entitlement left unchecked. The incident prompted conversations about ethics in business, the influence of family privilege, and the responsibilities that come with power, both financial and social. The emotional toll on everyone involved lingered. The young man faced a slow process of self-reflection, learning that charm and money could not shield him from consequences. He became more cautious, quieter, and in some ways more aware of the impact of his actions on others. His parents, forced to confront their failures as mentors and enablers, how they measured success and how their indulgence had shaped their son's worldview. Meanwhile, the CEO, despite the respect she earned, carried the subtle weight of having navigated a collision of human arrogance and authority, a reminder that moral courage often comes with personal cost. In reflection, the incident underscored broader truths about human behavior, power, and morality. It illustrated how privilege can insulate people from immediate consequences, fostering reckless behavior and distorted self-perception. It revealed the tension between authority earned through merit and influence inherited through wealth. The story also highlighted the delicate balance between justice and personal responsibility. The CEO's actions were decisive, ethical, and effective, demonstrating that accountability can exist even in worlds dominated by money and social standing. At the same time, it exposed the fragility of relationships built on superficial respect, the dangers of indulgence, and the psychological consequences of unchecked entitlement. Ultimately, the incident was more than a single act of impulsive behavior. It was a reflection of societal dynamics, ethical lapses, and the complex interplay of human motivations. The young man, his parents, and the CEO each emerged irrevocably changed, shaped by the collision of privilege and principle. The young man learned the hard limits of his world, the parents recognized the cost of indulgence, and the CEO reaffirmed the power of integrity in the face of reckless disregard. The story serves as a lasting reminder that morality, accountability, and human behavior are intertwined in ways that money, status, and influence cannot fully control. In the end, justice was not only a matter of law or wealth, it was a measure of courage, principle, and the willingness to face consequences, however uncomfortable they might be. The echo of that single reckless act, the tipping of the wine, resonated far beyond the room, illustrating a timeless truth. Privilege may cushion life's blows, but it cannot erase the human consequences of misjudgment, and accountability, once asserted, leaves no space for evasion. Each life touched by that moment carried its lessons, its guilt, and its transformation. And in that collision of arrogance, authority, and principle, the story became a testament to the enduring importance of ethics, self-awareness, and the quiet power of standing firm when the world expects compromise.